Samora Machel, Frelimo's liberation leader of Mozambique, had this to say in 1973, that the empowerment and emancipation of women should not be seen as an act of humanitarian conformity, but rather as a necessity for sustainable development and transformation. Well, we know that International Women's Day has been celebrated here in Uganda, but as we begin this conversation, we shall pick interest in evaluating the historical perspective. We know that it began as a labor movement, and later on, many years down the road, it was recognized internationally as a day set aside to recognize the gains and setbacks that we have registered as a continent, as a globe, regarding the empowerment of women. And we, of course, we know that this is partly because of the historical injustice that these groups faced, in society, and patriarchy and many other things. And to put this into perspective, I'm being joined by a panel of distinguished citizens of this country who are very immaculate in nature. And it's now my pleasure to introduce to you. From the extreme left is a constitutional lawyer and a consultant, I must say. That is a Counsel Christopher Okidi. Counsel, thank you for being here.
Yeah, it is always a pleasure to be on this show to talk about these very important issues around rights. And that is where development comes from. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Chris. Next to Chris and the gentleman in the middle is Joseph Ochieno from the Uganda People's Congress. We call him here the Congressman. Congressman, thank you for spending the time to be here.
It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be here in the capacity as a congressman, because the matter, the discussion is very important. It's part of a society, part of a community, and I'm delighted to say the Congress was implementing it 10 years before the Samora Machel statement. So absolute fantastic stuff.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, next to Joseph and next to myself is the only lady on the panel. That is Eunice Musiime. Eunice is the executive director of Akina Mama of Africa. Eunice, it's always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, Moses. And hello to all our viewers and listeners. It's really a delight and pleasure to be here, speak about a topic that delights my soul. So yes, happy to be here.
Wow, we are happy to have you too. Joseph, since you preempted my thoughts and began to dissect what Samora Machel said, is that as we celebrate International Women's Day, and personally I think that every day should be Women's Day, but well, the globe only acknowledges one day, 8th March. But just for the benefit of our viewers out there, how does the world find itself celebrating 8th March? The historical perspective leading towards that particular declaration.
You know, this is very interesting. This is a subject that could be taken back to the 17th century, 1700s. A campaign as far back as the time when the women folks were campaigning for and demanding for the rights to vote, the right to own property, the voices and spaces in their domestic households. It's been a long haul, so it's not something of the last several decades as it might be presented. And so exciting also to note that in many cases, women who led in various facets of global development were rarely recognized, partly because of the patriarchal nature of society. And so as nations grew and developed, and as the likes of the Samoras began to recognize that actually there's certain element of specialist skills, including soft power, that women enable them to use almost opportunistically, and not holistically from a convictionist ideological perspective, then that in itself began to help the cause. But if you take it back to the ideological question, the ideological angle from which people like myself do come, and indeed Uganda People's Congress comes from, you'll take us back to the 40s in this country, where there was conversation about the question of the African identity and the rights of the African personality in a holistic way in terms of the ownership of our nation state. And in many of those cases, it would normally be, what is it that an average household somewhere in Chinoni, an average household somewhere in Nakaseke, or indeed an average household in Atiak went through. And the more you did that, the more you realized that at the center were women, and at the center in terms of responses were women, and the center of, if you like, dealing with the core challenges would then be women. And so, not surprisingly, beyond that, as we developed from an activist organization to a political party, linking, thankfully in this case, with the ideological left, which tends to be much more openly progressive. Some of the things that Chris would have been talking about during the break, it became apparent and clear that if nations are to develop, and I'm bringing it fast forward to where Uganda is, if nations are to develop, if nations are to grow, not only will there be growth in terms of the population, but there will also be growth in quality of the citizenship at the time. And what were the underlying issues? And that's why at the independent stages, it was recognized that a new nation called the Republic of Uganda, at the core would be education, at the core would be health, at the core would be agriculture, at the core would be basic welfare of the people, holistic beyond health, and so therefore water, and access to every other basic essential requirements for society. But at the core of that would also be justice, therefore questions to do with domestic violence, with abuse of women, use and exploitation of women would have to be looked at. So early leaders without prejudice to whatever is happening today saw this as a requirement that if nations are to grow, women would have to be embedded as part of it. And so therefore the early independence government started to say that, look, what do we do? And it was not, that's the difference, not women at the top necessarily, because by then men had already been substantially at the top anyway, and the men were making the decisions. So this is where we are, a club of men. What do we do? We shall start from the grassroots. And so hence providing some of the basic necessities, and very urgently, very quickly. If you think, for instance, a country like Uganda, where the top political class were predominantly Protestant, although necessarily not the majority, then you think that, well, what do you do to the women folk majority who are not necessarily represented on the round table? What do? Open up educational access and opportunities as the number one most important thing. So the drive to providing a cultural education, the drive to providing quality education, the drive to providing a diverse education, the drive to providing a basic health to enable the African woman at the time, not necessarily about how much she's able to write, but what she basically needed in the household. And so that worked, and it worked very, very well. Fast forward to shortly before Idi Amin came to power. By and large, the boardroom women, just like the average representative women as part of an national economic indices, were generally not doing very bad. But it was not sufficiently politicized, not necessarily was it bigly driven. Fast forward to the 1985 Nairobi Women's Conference for the UN. Mama Miria, then as Uganda's first lady, led Uganda delegation, and I'm told she plus two other ladies, I can't remember, first ladies, actually raised very interesting, robust conversations about the emancipation of women broadly, something that was not very specifically, not very substantially highlighted in Beijing. But 10 years later, the Beijing conference came with a blow to this thing about, if you like, structuring, mainstreaming, and putting it on the national table. Part of my problem, and I'm just making a brief introduction for this, part of my problem is that while we've now talked about this almost as academic and political conversations at the microphone, the underlying challenges facing women, particularly rural women, in my opinion, has not been substantially addressed. And that is my problem. But regardless of whatever challenges we have, there has been a huge stride in the last 30 years, not only here, but across the world, to the extent that my brother Barack Obama was effectively elected because of women and young people and minorities in America. And so the world has suddenly woken up to the power of organized women, the capacity of organized women, the power of the soft power of women, the ability of women to lead. And I'm proud that in 1991, Obote appointed Cecilia Gual as the first president, de facto president of Uganda People's Congress, while in exile. I'll say this to this program, that former Minister Professor Tiberonda told us, as a group of young people in London, that they felt resentful that now Obote appoints this young girl, appointed this young girl as a leader. And it took us time to understand where Obote was coming from, so massively impressive. So, meaning, at the back of all these other things, there's a gender recognition. But how do we organize and mainstream these things and not politicize it and not turn it opportunistic, but genuinely recognize that the women folks are perhaps the most central a part of humanity, and that nurturing them would be a complementing society and humanity, especially at this time when global warming is taking place, when the world and destination of conflict we have no clue, and when our resources, natural resources, are getting increasingly at risk, and when politics of consensus, global consensus, is increasingly becoming a difficulty. I wonder, is it the case that in the event that I'm president of the Uganda People's Congress, that the person whom I hand over to is a woman, and not for political reasons, but genuinely somebody who's sufficiently equipped, with the due process of privilege as a matter of right, to take over from me, to become part of those voices on this continent, that perhaps they may be able to be the leaders of tomorrow, that are able to mobilize, organize, and secure resources, as do the women in families and homes, as do the women and families in communities, and do the women in boardroom. Secure our continent, become, if you like, the safe voices across the globe, so that perhaps the UN agency as a body becomes the government of the world tomorrow, where there's no conflict, but where our global resources are best used for the children of tomorrow. And after all, those children will be children born and enabled by women.
Wow, amazing. Eunice, still on the mischief behind International Women's Day, and as to why today we find ourselves having, Article 33 of the Constitution, we find ourselves being a signatory to the Maputo Protocol of Mozambique, and all these things. So the question is that, how do we find ourselves here? The mischief behind emancipation, the mischief behind trying to get women on a leveled scale. What is the mischief behind that?
Wow, thank you, Moses, and thank you, Joseph. It was quite interesting listening to that historical perspective and how you weaved it all together in terms of the geopolitics. So maybe just to say that it was apparent to all concerned, but more so the women themselves, that something was amiss.
Yeah.
I have met several women who say, I grew up looking at the picture and asking myself, why is it the way it is? Why is it that the other gender seems to be getting all these privileges and I don't seem to enjoy the same privileges? So having that extra eye and asking questions, and then coming together in community and asking again the why question, I think is what built the momentum towards women's rights, towards struggles for respect and promotion of women's rights, towards feminist struggles, because thousands and thousands of women really experienced, because a lot of it is really the lived experience of women, to say something is just wrong. Why is it that I cannot have a cordial conversation with my partner? Why does it always end in violence? Why is it that when I am able to access a job, I'm not having the same pay as my counterpart, which still happens, the gaps. So asking those questions and coming together with other women and just really sharing their experiences, and then realizing that there's something wrong with the way society has been structured, and continuing to ask, why is it that society has been structured to privilege one gender over the other? And so I must say a lot of this we must attribute to the feminists. Research has shown that all these struggles come full circle because of the hard work, the back-breaking hard work of feminists. It's feminists that have done all this theorizing. A lot of the times, people said, oh, maybe that's how society is. But feminists were able to theorize and establish that there's a power imbalance in society, and go to the root cause of that power imbalance and look at the system that is underlying that power imbalance, as patriarchy, as one of the systems. But there are others too, like capitalism that we're talking about just before the show started, that act to complement and entrench oppression, discrimination, exploitation. So I would say the momentum really grew out of the lived experiences of those and coming together in community and saying, no, enough is enough. We must do something about this. Yeah.
Wow, very brilliant. Chris,
Yes.
1217, the Magna Carta. And this was informed by the barons who rose up to say that, you know, they were being ruled under a tyranny of their king. But to me, precisely are the opening words of the Magna Carta. All man is born equal. When I hear Eunice saying that the liberation of women is anchored around the efforts of feminism or feminists, I beg to disagree, because I think that democracy and freedom and rights generally has been a struggle for humanity for a very long period of time. And even the emancipation of women, to me, only comes as a result of the general struggles for liberty and freedoms. So, but I want to hear your perspective.
Yes.
As we evaluate the emancipation of women, what is your sociological understanding?
I want to be like that judge who, when the complainant came and said, they stole my chicken, and he said, you're right, they stole your chicken. Then when the defendant also came and defended and said, I did not steal the chicken, then he said, you're also right, you did not steal the chicken. So both of you are right. That is a draw judgment.
I like that.
Yeah, so what's your perspective?
Yeah, but for me, generally, I think it is about time to congratulate women upon the achievements they've made. Because the world today for women is different than it was 50 years ago. And it is different than it was maybe a century ago. So for me, I think it is also now about time to congratulate the efforts of women. I think women have made a successful comeback.
Okay.
Yeah, because you see, it is not true that women have been oppressed throughout history, you see? But they were oppressed at some points of history. Because there was also a time when women were actually in charge of the world.
Oh, really?
Yes, matriarchy. In Greece, they actually used to pray to female gods, the Eunice, you see? So for women, it has always been a roller coaster, that at some point you're on top, and then men say, but why are they on top? Then men also come and do another gender revolution or equality crusade and come in. But but we must all agree that all this fluidity in terms of who is on top in the gender power structure, of course, is determined by privilege. That is a fact, because the reason why women actually, because we lived in a society where women were in charge. It was matrilineal, and that is why you hear the saying that maternity is a matter of fact, and it is paternity which is a matter of faith. So if even you, Kidega, when you're born, your lineage is your mother's lineage. We've ever been in that point of history in the world, you see? But now, because of advancement, development, and also that is now when the economy started taking shape. That is when men also now decided to stage a coup on women and said, you see, we need to control women, because once you control a woman, her children are your children, you know? Because then there was nothing like even jealousy, saying that Eunice is my wife. There was nothing like possession. But possession came in as an economic imperative. You see? That you see, the world, we are now becoming, we are now moved from the Paleolithic age, and now we were now beginning to form an economic system. And now the formation of that economic system is now what brought the whole question of privilege. Men said, now, you see, what we need is everyone must have a wife, and those children born are yours. Why? So that they are employed in the farm for farming purposes. That is why family, the word family, comes from the Latin word famulus, which is slaves, you know. So the whole issue is about privilege and competition over resources. And that is why men upstaged women. And of course, they were on top of the food chain for a long time, until women now started to demand their due economic social rights, and then their franchise, their political civil rights in form of a franchise in elections. So that is why when we say we need to congratulate women, we also know that from the point where men overthrow women, women insubordination has been at the worst point in human history. And then having also successfully theorized, like she was saying, feminists. Of course, feminists did a lot of theorization, critical feminist gender perspectives that can try to expose what norms in society are intended to subjugate women. You see that? So me, I think women have succeeded in now. I think we are now at an age of gender equality. For me, that is what I want to say. Because, and you know my views are really very controversial, but that is what I want to say. We have already achieved gender equality. And what we have always categorized as the gender equality crusade was actually a gender revolution crusade to now give women, to first of all bring women at that level where they can now engage with men on the same table. And if you did a stock taking, really, I think even when you look at our educational statistics, you know, by 2019, before COVID came in, we actually even had 50-50 primary school enrollment, girl child, you see? So that what that crusade meant then, that, you see, educational opportunities should be provided for both. And in our own government structures, we've seen women increase in number. We've seen a lot of progressive policies in terms of all the plethora of gender mainstreaming and gender equality legislations and policies that we have. Of course, someone may talk about its implementation. That's a different issue. But at least there is a general national psychic in Uganda that has already been achieved, or world over that has already been achieved, of equality. To a point that people are actually even now worried that now, what about the boy child? People are now actually, in fact, the worry is now headed towards the boy child. That, you see, we have empowered women so much that the boy child has completely been forgotten. You see? So how then, so that is why the strategy for feminists next should actually now be gender cooperation. You see? Yes, gender cooperation. You see, you have already achieved.
This guy is a lobbyist, man.
No, you have already achieved gender equality. Let us agree.
Okay.
Gender equality has already been achieved.
Let's first discuss that particular statement, whether we have achieved gender equality or not. And Joseph, I want to bring you in, because perhaps if I'm to put myself in Chris's shoes, and you're to look at the facts as they are, is that our cabinet today in Uganda is 43% women. Our National Assembly has a good number of women representation, 34%. There is a government initiative that is specifically tailored towards empowerment of women economically. There are all these social revolutions happening here and there. So perhaps that could substantiate why Okidi thinks that that there is gender equality.
Unfortunately not, and it's a risky supposition, and I'll take you back to the fair draw Chris gave to him, to both you and Eunice. The contextual background of some of these debates, while it can be confined to the feminist movements, in my opinion, and as a matter of fact, I think, considering where we are now in this conversation, would really take us back to the social theories around what you possibly call functionalism, the concept of Marxism, feminism then, social action theory, and postmodernism. But, to be very precise, to suggest, therefore, that because we now have some 40-something percentage of women in cabinet, all of whom, and I mean all of whom, are political appointees of a privileged man who chooses to even appoint his wife on that place, and a man who does not really have a mandate, because Mr. Museveni.
Joseph,
No.
Joseph, you earlier on you gave us an example of your party leader who appointed his wife. So why should it be an issue when the NRM leader appoints his wife, and it's not an issue when the UPC?
But also the wife succeeded the husband as party president in UPC.
Both of you are being very simplistic, and you're being very motively political. And if I were here in my position, as I am, I would strongly advise that you kept calm and made the best use of my experience. Okay?
Yeah.
Yes. And I never make emotional observations. And I try my level best to be as scholarly on some of these issues as possible, as evidence-based as possible. And when it comes to this particular subject, which is as emotive as Chris would suggest that he dare not refer to his personal opinion, I will tell you that Milton Obote was uncontestedly elected president of Uganda People's Congress in the manifesto, in the Constitution. So if that is the appointment, by virtue of that, and you're the two lawyers, I'm talking about Museveni, to whom nobody elected to State House. So what answer do you give? Anyway, I was really trying to build this. I'm making a case for women, not party political.
Yeah.
And so what I'm simply saying is that, look, all these women.
But by the way, to support Joseph, Joseph, by the way, when he makes statements about UPC and women, they are not unfounded. Because at least when you read Silver Tamale's When Hens Begin to Crow, yeah, she actually even gives a lot of evidence suggesting that UPC earlier on had started to integrate women. Of course, she also mentioned, I was actually saying that Joseph's statement, by the way, about UPC and the antecedents regarding women empowerment is actually not unfounded, because when you read When Hens Begin to Crow, Silvia Tamale presents statistics of female candidates in political parties. And until even 1980, DP had 2 female candidates, but UPC had always been having. So I think it is just fair that we do acknowledge that. Yeah,
Sure.
Yeah, but so broadly in context, I was actually trying to make a much more scientific argument on this, that I wouldn't be talking about equality yet, that unless we are able to give a qualitative assessment of the reality of the state of the woman today, that the community development centers that UPC built, for which my mother became literate. I think it's important for us to contextualize this and, if you like, scientifically quantify it, that it would possibly still be unreasonable to suggest that we hit the women equality level unless we're able to consider what really is happening to the average woman folk in maybe rural Atiak, maybe somewhere in rural
even here in
Kayunga, and as you rightly say,
here.
on average, perhaps here in Kampala. And what you guys thought I was politicizing the national element, because Mr. Museveni is an appointed, is a president, and he appoints. This is a huge percentage of women, but in most cases purely as patronage. And in fact, in many cases, he calls them his girls, which I actually find rather insulting. And that's the point I was trying to make. Now, Mr. Museveni's own leadership is contested, because as far as UPC is concerned, I don't recognize who elected him in 1986. So if you want to talk the democratization process of these things. And while I was actually referring back to the historical context, if you could just allow me to do it, because I know you would. I know you have very soft spot for NRA.
No. My question, Joseph, is that wasn't that debate settled by the Hans Kelsen theory?
It's irrelevant because I don't think that settlement qualifies the point which I'm trying to make, very important point about women and women emancipation in this country. So I'm simply saying again that, look, women are still dependents, if you like, political dependents on most of these figures. in cases where you talk about the affirmative action representation for national assemblies, women occupy those positions, granted, but it's a huge burden to district women representatives. I think it's absolutely unfair, although I am for a future UPC government would review this affirmative action district women position. So I think it is only being allowed to
And
happen.
the districts as well.
Indeed, and the district, but it's only being allowed to happen because it's women. Had it actually been seats for men, there would have been sufficient pressure for these positions to change. The amount of monies they get, the amount of allowances they get, already MPs get a huge amount of money anyway, you know. But so when we talk about the question of equality of women, now Chris talked about the enrollments. We will still have to ask ourselves, how many young people enroll at primary level in P1 and how many do actual primary leaving exams?
Yeah.
How many complete primary leaving exams and go to secondary schools? And how many of them complete senior 4? How many of those who complete senior 4 and how many of them go to senior 6? So yes, granted, in terms of the level of performance, you know, that's a welcome start. But is it about equity? No, it's an emphasis of the point that actually get my young, beautiful daughters, and actually my daughters are fantastic, you know, put them in the same class with the boys of the same age. Of course, the girls in most cases will perform excellently. I have been lucky to mentor young women and men, both here and abroad. And in many cases, actually found young female mentees much more organized, much more focused, much more composed, and much more determined. It may also be about social factors. And I ask myself then, for the people whom I mentor, if it were the case that the environment in which I mentor these people is one which you'll find in Kamdini, perhaps, then we would say we are reaching somewhere for the women folks. So we still have a long way to go. But final point, that long way must be one in which we are addressing the underlying issues for the girl-child experiences in rural spaces, those in Kampala. The challenges women face in rural spaces, whether it's about health, education, again, talk about infrastructure, but talk about including infrastructure, by the way. It's the average woman, the average Ugandan woman, including, without prejudice, Eunice, who has to bother that do I leave the office at 4, you know, and take 4 hours in NRA traffic, yeah? And my children down there, and Mr. may or may not necessarily tuck them into bed, but actually part of my responsibility is to check on whether or not, in this case, if she's got a home help, a dinner is sorted well for the children. So there's a gender implication in this thing. So it's actually absolutely huge. I would suggest that going forward, these matters of gender should not be matters that should be celebrated and people make big conversations over it in Kiruhura, and people make assignments and seek monies for their fuel going to Kiruhura once a year, but rather that these are holistically embedded matters of national policy on a daily basis, because women live these things, lived experience on a daily basis, just like, well, by and large, all of us as human to have these things, lived experience. But because they're the engine of our population, I would suggest that it is still far too long a long way to go as far as women equality of women is concerned. Final point, take it back to the villages. These things about marriages, these things about access to land. I know in the dynamics in my own family. I also know my own extended family where some guy had his daughters and left behind a will. And this is something which was being contested in court because allegedly the clan is talking many of these issues. I have, again, another very powerful extended Ugandan family where a guy died, left his wife. His wife was a national politician. I don't want to make reference to it. But the children, simply because they lived abroad, their cheeky uncle is right now seeking to control the family. Although these children, some of them, in fact, the girl child is already over 50. And simply because the eldest child is a girl, you know, it's neither here nor there. So these things, Chris, unfortunately, are real. Eunice, my suggestion to you going forward is that this conversation should be mainstreamed so that it's actually not seasonal. And mainstreaming these issues are not about the scares around gender and feminism. I think the definition of feminism will have to come back and review it nationally. But to recognize, as UPC did, as Uganda National Congress in the 50s, even before our independence, that no, mainstreaming of gender issues is mainstreaming the social, political, and economic realities of our country. And the sooner and the more we do that, particularly as a continent, the best and the better it will be for our people. Especially, final point, Congo You know, the victims in Congo, which normally sometimes want you to break down, the majority of them are women and children.
All right. Eunice, Joseph thinks it's too early to call. Chris thinks we have hit the gender equality mark.
They should be
So-
congratulated.
Congratulations. But Eunice, to me, it's a question of form versus substance. All right? That as a matter of form, if you look at it on paper, wow, it looks very brilliant. Vice President is a woman, Speaker of Parliament, Prime Minister. On paper, it looks very, very brilliant. Woman members of Parliament and all these things. But the substance of it, we still know that teenage pregnancies continue to teenage pregnancies, early child marriages, access to maternity health, all these things. So I don't know, what side of the coin do you fall?
Thank you, Moses, and thank you, of course, to Joseph and Chris for their perspectives. I don't usually quote UN statistics, but I think I will this time. So right now, the UN claims that it's going to take us about 300 years to achieve gender equality. Actually, in fact, on International Women's Day, it was described as diminishing progress. So the progress that we've even made is diminishing, meaning that all the gains are being stripped away. While on the other hand, before COVID, the World Economic Forum actually estimated that it would take 125 years to hit gender equality. And that's even looking at the bare minimum, the minimalist of it all. So it's not even a question of form versus substance. Yes, we do celebrate the gains. We celebrate the fact that I could walk here and speak on this forum without seeking permission from a male dependent, that I can go to school. Girls are able to go to school in Uganda, but not everywhere, because we also know the situation of other countries like Afghanistan, where the Taliban have just decided and overturned everything. Girls can go to school, and even in terms of their health, they can only see a female practitioner. But if girls can't go to school, how are you supposed to also seek medical services from a female practitioner? So it doesn't add up. Or in Saudi Arabia, where women can only drive if they are with their brothers or male dependent or etc. So definitely, the statistics are quite clear that yes, we've made progress, but that progress is still a very, very, very long way to go. Even when we look at the situation in Uganda right now, the numbers, they say numbers tell a lot, but they can also be really tell nothing. One of the things we say as feminists a lot of the times is that do we have women in power without power? Meaning, do these women actually have influence? I've been seeing the viral videos of the Prime Minister, and with all humility, all due respect, I'm like, what's going on here? Is she playing her Prime Minister role? What role is she actually playing? And I take time as a feminist not to really criticize publicly our female folk. But what I would say is that when the governance of a country is not working as effectively and as functionally as it should work, of course, the first victims are women, to be used and abused as tokens. So we speak about this whole tokenism. Yes, you do have a female Speaker of Parliament. You do have 34% of members of Parliament as women. But I mean, many have not even made their maiden speech in Parliament. You'd really need to interrogate further whether we are achieving the representation, which we call descriptive representation, and not necessarily the substantive representation. And for us as feminists, the substantive representation is where we actually see these women having that consciousness of women's rights, of the women's agenda, of governance. Of course, women's rights do not exist in a vacuum. It has to exist. Are we seeing development in this country? So there's no way we can even talk about achievement of women's rights in a state like Uganda, where our development metrics are doing so badly. even if we were to use the issue of poverty, statistics recently released showed that we are making reversals even in terms of poverty. And we know that poverty is also feminized. Who are the majority of people who are impoverished? It's women and girls. So even when we speak about the fact that we are getting more people in Uganda falling back in terms of poverty, it means that they are women. So we also need to be able to ask those questions. When you think about beyond even education, let's go into health. Out of 1,000 births, we know that 300 of those of women, we are losing those on a daily. The statistic that is often quoted is really 16 women a day. When you think about 16 women a day, that's a lot. It's a lot of us losing needlessly. The word is needlessly. No one should be dying while giving life to another. So we still have that statistic. We still have statistics in terms of land ownership, even if you move away from customary ownership. In terms of land ownership, it's barely above 30% of registered land that is owned by women. And yet, land is a factor of production. Before you can access any finances, our banks have not yet transcended to ask for all these documents, collateral, etc. So if women hardly own land, what collateral are you going to even present in terms of women's economic justice? Because we are looking at all political, social, and economic. I know Joseph has talked a lot about the plight of women who live in rural areas or girls who live in rural areas. But women are not homogeneous. Even in these so-called big walled homes, there's a lot of social issues that are pertaining that are not being addressed. For a long time as a lawyer, I worked for the Uganda Law Society and also as a FIDA member. And the cases we received as FIDA were not necessarily from women from rural areas. Of course, we do community.
In fact, predominantly not from rural areas.
From rural areas, yeah. But yeah, there were women from all these affluent families that are facing all these challenges, and they've not changed. We've talked about, recently we saw a ruling by the Judicial Service Commission regarding Justice Esther Chisache pertaining to her effectiveness and whether she's able to deliver as a justice. On the face of it, you can look at it as being ineffective, but no one actually knows the environment in which women, even in the judiciary, are working in. So we're not asking these questions. Even these members of parliament that are up in arms against all these sexual acts. Sexual harassment is rife and deeply entrenched in parliament. And I would like to challenge Madam Speaker to even look into that, the plight of women parliamentarians. What sort of environment are they working in? Is it enabling them to flourish and thrive in politics? Or why is it that, even when I say that some have not even made their maiden speech, why is it that they are not able to actually stand and thrive in such a political space? Because the environment is toxic.
Can I just, that's very interesting, Moses.
Yeah, sure.
Eunice, it's interesting you raised that. To the extent that perhaps, with hindsight, my beautiful sister Anita could just have opted or elected that she were going to give opportunity to all women members of parliament to actually make their maiden speeches, and because it's within her powers to give how female folks priority. I hadn't thought about it in that way. I allocate specific time and to see how it goes. But that said, as another complementary point, I've got a friend who's a legislator who was hounded out of a very powerful position. I don't want to say much because it's fairly public, by men folks in her home district. and this person lost a very important position of influence. And while there are nuances about other issues that may include faith, it's very clearly the case that her gender was substantially played. Very sad. And finally, Eunice, I have personally intervened in at least three major domestic issues at Kampala involving high-profile families, high-profile individuals. In two cases, clearly upper-middle-class families involving domestic violence. And that is only within the last 3 years. And as you know, I'm not a practicing lawyer, nor do I have, am I a member of FIDA.
But you are a
of FIDA
senior
board.
citizen,
And
like Moses calls
and
you.
in many cases, in fact, in one case, the individual had no clue and absolutely had no belief that she could do anything about it. So this,
and Joseph, you're right. When you look at the police crime reports, and maybe that's where we need to direct our honorable members of parliament. When we look at the police crime reports, the third highest crime is actually domestic violence. And when you look at the numbers of how many are reported, and many don't report, the numbers of how many are reported and actually how many make it through the justice system, they're very, very few. Very few actually make it because, one, the police is not well resourced to do investigations or to take it forward, or anyway, women's issues are always trivialized. But when you look at the police crime report, and the highest crimes are actually sexual crimes. So when you think about rape,
actually, I didn't know that. No.
Yes, when you look at about rape, defilement, and Moses talked about teenage pregnancy. When we interrogated the issue of teenage pregnancy before and even after COVID, a lot of the perpetrators were not even external parties. They were in-house. So children were safe in schools. But as soon as now children were left in the communities, they were then at risk. And who are the perpetrators? Brothers, fathers, all these people. So I haven't seen people demonstrating against the police crime reports. And yet we know that Uganda actually deeply has a sexual acts problem. It's a serious one. So we really need to be able to use the data, use the evidence to interrogate. And I dare say, if you asked members of parliament, women, how many of you have experienced violence in this house, it will be all. There would not be a single one who hasn't experienced it. That's how, yes, seriously, that's how.
It will not be 90%, it will be 100?
It will be 100. That's how dire the situation is. But have we seen the Speaker of Parliament coming up in uproar against this vice? No, we haven't.
Is that a formal challenge to her?
Yes, it is. And I dare say that Parliament doesn't even have a sexual harassment policy. Yet we do know that this is deeply rife in Parliament. So yes, so these are issues that, so when we talk about, so a lot of the times people say, oh, okay, so the women have made it to public office. How come they're not making as much impact? There are a lot of structural systemic barriers to their ability to thrive. And so they can't. When you think about, oh my goodness, by the way, women were very kind. If we were to do a name and shame, my dear Okidi.
Hello, sister.
If we were, Akina Mama, we train a lot of young women.
So we better be careful. Yeah?
So we all know all these stories of the patriarchs in political spaces. So I've even now veered away from Parliament if we are to go to the political spaces. And they're very blatant. As soon as a young woman says, I would like to stand for this office, the man will say, you know what you're supposed to you know what you're supposed to do. You know what you're supposed to do, from the highest echelons of political parties.
That is true, because I led the Youth League of the Democratic Party. So I remember there is this lady, Adiambo or Adiambo. She's a consultant on gender. So I remember she was commissioned by UN Women to come to the Democratic Party on around a sexual harassment policy. So she was struggling that, are they even going to accept this whole idea? I told her, you come and attend DP management. I will introduce you. And indeed, the Democratic Party has a sexual harassment policy. So I also don't want, I also really don't want men to really, we are really not demons the way people want to portray. We are really not demons. If we also to do name and shame, even me, I've been a victim of sexual harassment. But because we don't name and shame.
Name and shame.
Yes, but I have also been, like when I was starting out on my career as a researcher, yes, I cannot say I have not got sexual harassment, but
perhaps maybe the difference is in percentage.
But you see, for men, it is even worse. You know, men who are victims of sexual and gender-based violence, theirs is even worse because, you know, there's a way masculinity.
The form and the context.
You know, there's a way the nature of African men is such that you can never ever be.
A
woman can never sexual. So for them, they don't know how to draw a boundary between sexual harassment when a woman is sexually harassing them, and of course their nature that you see you lose your masculinity when you concede and say a woman is sexually
when you appear vulnerable.
Yes. But I think it is just fair that I give a rejoinder.
Sure.
Yeah, about it's very important.
What these two eminent panelists have brought forward. First of all, civil society, United Nations, think tanks, and every other place, you know, they have to problematize to remain relevant. You know, they have to problematize. Because if you're writing a project proposal about women, you are really to show that the situation is so bad so that you justify why capital must enter your pocket. You see that? So if UN, for example, said, gender equality has been achieved. Do you know how many people are going to lose jobs tomorrow? It's a whole question of political economy. Who gains and who loses out of this all? You need to look at these lenses, these political economy lenses, because the women, the plight of women has now become of industrial scale. People are making business out of it. People are making careers out of it. People are doing a lot of things. So they will always try to problematize and show as if not, women are going to die tomorrow so that they get resources. But you see, for me in advocacy, it is good to problematize. And that is, even me, I problematize a lot for advocacy purposes, to highlight a particular problem. It is good to problematize. I do problematize. And for policy advocacy, it is good to problematize. But you see, success, now let me talk like an M&E, as someone who has ever done M&E for NGOs also. Let me now talk about, now how then do you evaluate this whole issue of gender equality? Now, for me, and by the way, it is also a very big problematic around how then do you monitor, evaluate, and learn from advocacy programs. You know, there are certain things you cannot quantify as women empowerment, you see? But women empowerment is human rights, you see? That is, women are human beings. And we should first of all understand that women deserve their rights because they are first of all human beings. You see that? And so they are human rights. Now, the issue why we are now saying it is women's rights is because we know whereas they are human beings, they really suffer legitimate injustice. And so affirmative action, special programs, special attention must be focused to lift them up. But the biggest metrics of success for gender equality is the consciousness of a population. The question is, in Uganda, is there a consciousness that has been achieved in terms of accepting the fact that you must respect a woman you must respect her rights. I think that consciousness is there. You see? Of course, I also
Chris,
don't want to.
That,
I also
that
don't want to.
consciousness vis-a-vis what
Yes,
Eunice was
consciousness.
saying.
I need to
You
ask
see, these
Chris.
are
the
things
police
we can
statistics.
resolve.
Can I ask Chris
Yes.
one question? When you look at Africa, of course, now we celebrate that we have 2 female African presidents.
Liberia?
Liberia left.
Suhulu,
Yeah,
Tanzania.
Sulu and Ethiopia, which is really like not really there. Does that picture look right to you?
Now, first of all, I also don't want to be very unfair to there are certain legitimate concessions I have to make. That one, we need more women at the top echelons. And by the way, studies even show that women are better leaders than men. That is a fact. You see that?
Those are binary studies.
Of course,
yeah.
but
we also need to move away from who is superior, who is not.
Exactly. That is why I earlier on said that if feminists, you see, feminists also need to now change strategy. Feminists need to change strategy because confrontation, binary, these binaries, such as men, women, space, all that. You see, I now want to look at, I now want a dispensation. That is why I say, let's now ditch all these concepts such as gender equality. Let's now look at gender cooperation. Because for 2 centuries, we've worked at building a very strong consciousness. And by the way, you need to know that the achievements women have made is also partly because of the love of men. Because men love women. You see? Because of the love of men. Because men love women. And so there are women. Because of love, you cede space, man.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's why NRM ceded
Yes.
NRM ceded space
Yes.
to DP out of love.
But you see, the pedagogy moving forward for feminism should actually be tapping as many men as possible to the feminist cause. So that is why I now say, let's ditch all these binary perspectives and now begin to look at gender cooperation. Because legitimately, there are problems that women have that require all of us to work towards it. But in working towards that problem, the boy child should also not join SMAO easily because he's really challenged.
Okay.
No, I'm conscious of time, and so I'd actually want to suggest that Chris raises interesting points that broadens the debate. That perhaps it would be unfair if we did not concede that there are issues, and it would be possibly unfair if we did not suggest that maybe it's a realm that may perhaps require a separate debate in whole. So maybe it's a subject that we need to revisit, but in slightly different context. But I just wanted to build on to what Eunice was saying much earlier, and perhaps nuanced suggestions from Chris, considering the fact that Chris was a youth leader for the Democratic Party, and so they're an eminent young politician of the future. That this debate, when we're discussing the qualitative context of women's realities today, that as Eunice challenged my beautiful sister Anita in the National Assembly and many of our colleagues in positions of power, perhaps, I don't know why I did not challenge the lady responsible for education who has privilege to share breakfast with Mr. Museveni as a sort of the national budget, but that maybe political parties are challenged that these matters become qualitative contents of their future programs called manifestos. I'm just giving them free advice. It's always the natural in UPC. But I think that these are things that the more we actually debate, I genuinely believe when I was giving the social theoretical basis away from feminism, but pushing it even towards postmodernism and, if you like, other concepts like Marxism, that the more you realize, the more you contextualize, the more you deeply critique, the more you then realize that in society, what is the net value in terms of youth engagement when you make the best use of them in society, what is the net benefit of certain professions in society, when you look at the demographics of a nation state, where they, and then if you look at the total number of women in society, what net contribution do they make, you come up with a common sense a conclusion that you need to ensure that a pot of citizens, if they're 10 employees of yours, that they're sufficiently equipped, they're sufficiently trained, they're sufficiently enabled, they're sufficiently housed, they're sufficiently protected, including health provisions, and that they're sufficiently cultured in such a manner that they embed with the culture of that organization to be able to deliver the total outcomes. Absolute common sense.
Well, Eunice, do you want to make your point now, or we take a short commercial break? Then
We
we'll
can
get
take a short
All
commercial
right.
break.
Thank you. We are due for a short commercial break, but thank you for making a date with us this afternoon. We know that you have opinions regarding women emancipation, and there's a comment section right below this YouTube channel. Give us your views. Let's know what you think. But above all, keep with us. See you shortly after.
Digital rights are those human rights and legal rights that allow individuals to access, use, create and publish digital media, or to access and use computers, other electronic devices and telecommunication networks. Digital rights include a right to freedom of expression, information and communication through technology, a right to privacy and data protection, a right to credit for personal works, a right to universal and equal digital access, a right to identity, a right to anonymity, a right to be forgotten, and a right for protection of minors, among others. The state's digital rights are frequently violated through various unfair actions, for example, blockage of websites and social networks, theft of credentials, unauthorized use of people's data for personal gain, privacy intrusion.
Hello. We'll be back from that short commercial break, and we shall just continue from where we stopped. Eunice, before this eminent gentleman, interrupted a bit, you are making your point. So I'll give you that opportunity to finish up.
Thank you, Moses. These gentlemen are quite interesting. But we do interact with men, and part of our, let me not say disappointment or shock, surprise, let me use the word surprise. Part of our surprise is when we have men in the human rights sector who have refused to raise their consciousness on women's issues and are often shocked by the reality of women. And yet when you speak about their mothers and sisters, they are woke, but when it comes to their partners, to those they work with, etc. So it seems like a duality, and maybe that's a mute question for a research that one needs to undertake. I also just wanted to counter what Chris said about women's rights being human rights. It's only in 1992 at a Vienna conference when women's rights were actually recognized as human rights, as funny as it sounds, because I mean, women's rights are human rights, aren't they? But it took that recognition for people to say, yeah, even women's rights are human rights. And maybe that's also the debate that we are currently having right now with the anti-homosexuality bill in Parliament about what are rights and what are not rights. And so maybe as women that have been marginalized for a long time, we appreciate that struggle of when your rights are questioned, whether they are rights or not. So I just thought I should add that. And that's why women continue to have all these conferences that bring us together to come up with new understanding, new knowledge, and new information on why this is important. We're having this conversation at a point in time when a major women's conference is taking place, the Commission on the Status of Women, which meets annually in New York. Actually, we are contesting why it meets in New York. It should also be rotated and we meet elsewhere. But it meets during the month of March, which is the Women's Month, to really take stock of the gains that women have made and then come up with propositions or proposals of where we need to go. And Chris, because of our lived reality, it's not that because we've made a career out of women's rights, it's because it's a whole industry, because the UN must exist. It's really just the reality. Let me use the statistics of child marriage, which is quite close to my heart, because that's the one violation I truly do not understand. Why men would want to sleep with a 12-year-old. Like, that's the one thing I don't get. I need a psychologist, someone who studies human nature, to help me understand it. So the issue, I don't even want to call it child marriage. We should call it what it is. It's rape.
Yeah, rape.
Yeah, and what are the statistics of child marriage? So are people merely problematizing this situation? No. And Uganda has one of the highest statistics of early unions. Let me not even call them marriages, because that doesn't befit a marriage. That is rape. I won't even call it defilement. So no one is trying to problematize this issue merely for the sake of self-gain or anything like that. It's really just saying, where I live, I live very close to here. And during COVID, people knowing that I am a lawyer and also a woman, the calls I used to get, Eunice, can we meet? Can we meet and talk about this? They were all domestic violence cases. And this is in an area where you have middle class, so-called middle class citizens in Uganda. So you want to ask yourself, why is this still happening? And so I totally disagree that we've gotten to a point where there's that national consciousness. When you think about the fact that women struggle to even make it to public office, it's a whole public perception about women's leadership. When you ask even women or men, who is your ideal candidate? If we're even just seated here and I asked Moses, would you vote for Joseph for UPC president or Eunice?
I'd vote for Eunice.
Yeah, even me, I would vote for Eunice.
That one I would lose, but I can assure you I would not go to the bush.
You'll not go to the bush. But yeah, in the boardrooms.
But fair enough. No, we get the point.
In the boardrooms, yes, but out there in the communities, women are not seen as leaders.
You see, I don't want you to take my, maybe my point was very extreme, but I don't want you to take it to the extreme. Me, I know very well that people make careers out of the problems in their society. It is called a biographical context question.
Oh, wow.
You see? Yes, biographical context question.
Yes.
Because you ask yourself, Mamdani is a very powerful global scholar from Uganda. Why did he make it that way? Because he was addressing first his problem of his community around statelessness. That is why he writes, neither citizen nor settler, citizen or subject, you know? So people make careers around their biographical context. So I also don't want Eunice to again.
So you know why? You know why?
Industrial point to.
You know why I took your industrial point is oftentimes we are told as feminists that that's a foreign agenda. Oftentimes, and why people think that these women's rights have been imported from elsewhere, that they're not part of our tradition, they're not part of our culture. But we also know that culture evolves. Culture evolves according to the context. So if previously, I think my grandmother was married by the age of 15. But I wouldn't see Moses at 50 marrying a 15-year-old.
You don't know.
Yeah, but you see, but Eunice.
Moses, tell us.
I have to shift gears
just a minute. Eunice, just on what Eunice said.
Yeah.
You see, the problem here is, like you say.
Okay, in 1 minute, because I want to shift gears with you particularly.
Yeah, just in 1 minute. Yeah, like what Eunice is saying. The problem, it is not Western. You see, Ugandans should first, the problem with the West and their approach to human rights, democracy, is because they came with and sold a pedagogy that it is theirs and not ours. And yet these things are actually ours. So they should have used the religious approach of enculturation, using those values, the antecedents of those values in our culture as an entry point to bring behavioral change. Now, what they decided to do is that we Africans don't respect women's rights and all that. That is why now Africans have it in their psyche. that it is a Western thing. But what we need to know is that progress, human civilization is a whole. It's a whole history approach, whole society approach. So it may just start in Africa, but end up in Europe. Or it may start in Europe and end up, the whole issue is it is human civilization and it is about humanity. So these things of race, Africanicity, or Western dichotomies are not necessary. Yeah.
Okay, so let me conclude my point by saying that the status of women politically, economically, socially has changed, but not much, and that we need to continuously reflect and find out why. While for a long time we looked at patriarchy as a system of oppression, we're beginning to understand that it's now an intersectional approach that is required. We can't just look at one, we must consider all these other systems of oppressions that are in place merely to keep the woman and girl child in that condition. So we'll continue the struggle. It's a struggle. Rights are not gotten freely, they must be fought for. So we'll continue the fight for women's rights.
Yeah,
And we support you.
Just
We shall
like,
be there to support
just
you.
like Mandela said, the walk to freedom is a long walk. Yes, Joseph, you have a point to add on?
No, I think if you're just basically concluding it, because I think maybe...
No, we are still on the women
I'm still on the women's stuff.
but just
Indeed,
but
I would just like to say this, that as you know, I'm UPC and a feminist, and that my feminism is not really derived from anything strange. That every other time, even as we have more of these conversations, I just want to reemphasize this, particularly for the young guys and for the young viewers, both male and female, particularly some of the concerns raised by Chris. I have a very particularly interesting experiences. That mine is basically convictionist from my ideology, political ideology meaning UPC, and number two, based on my faith. And number three, my family upbringing and background. And number four, my relative scholarly work. And the more I actually do it, the more convinced I am that I'm actually right and that this is a matter that actually should be addressed globally. And so sometimes when I punch NRA, and they really deserve to be punched, people think it's actually political. On the basis of my knowledge and understanding and experience and history, I actually think there is a huge amount of injustice that they're trying to do to the women folks. But I want to say this. Eunice, in my family, my grandfather was a powerful anti-colonial activist whose leg was broken, fighting against imperialism. That's why I feel very strongly that we have an NRA regime, which is basically a Nyampala regime for imperialism. But my grandmother was boss in our family, and I was just thinking, as I was thinking of bringing this, my maternal grandparents, I saw very little of my grandfather because there was really the other generation. My mother was the last born in the trail. But I saw my grandmother. My grandmother, maternal grandmother, was again boss in an array of a very huge family. Then come to my family, my mother was boss in our household. And then when I look at the broader society, broader community of ours, my grandfather's household, and indeed my grandfather's cousin's household, which are the two major units, I actually don't see the marginalization of women by men in terms of control, except the economic disadvantage and disparities. So this thing that the subject being discussed is something which is alien is a nonsense. Women need access to health. Women need access to education. Women need to be enabled so that those who don't have opportunity to gain education and so therefore to go and toil the land to be given opportunity. Women in northern Uganda, in Chris's place that has been raped and junked by NRA over 20 years, need to be enabled with the specialist facilities for them to return to their lands and livelihoods. Women in Karamoja need to be enabled. It's a common sense, including this iron sheet nonsense that I don't want to go into. And we have Karamoja children in the street, particularly girl children, in the streets of Kampala. This is what we're talking about in the streets of Kampala, and we don't ask what brought them out. And remember, when we have this conversation, people begin to say, oh, those lazy Karamojong. And that's simplistic. That's our responsibilities as leaders and political leaders. These are the issues. We need to be able to deal with the underlying issues, that affect particularly and predominantly women. As I was coming stuck in traffic, not far away from these studios, I saw a woman, must be a woman from the north, carrying a child, wrapped behind her, with trays of maybe, these
Mangoes, huh?
not mangoes. I think must be these empty bottles.
Hey.
Three sacks of them, and she's trying to balance them. And I felt absolutely sad, including asking myself how much money she was going to raise this. So you're quite right about the Kampala element. The Kampala element is the ruling classes, the upper middle classes, the middle classes, and indeed the downtrodden in the streets of Uganda, streets of Kampala. Those are the most vulnerable. So there's a common sensible thing about our society. It's absolutely a national and global security question, the question of enabling and creating equality for women. And so this is not something that should be politicized. Politicized, though, in the manner in which I challenge political leaders of political organizations and some of them that call themselves parties, to come on the table next time to meet me with us, Ochieno, we see what their programs are on the question of mainstreaming and enabling women as part of our community going forward.
Wow, amazing. Chris,
Yes.
let's shift gears a bit to evaluate the legal framework, both internationally and domestically here in Uganda. Do you think it guarantees the emancipation and progress of women? Because I know, for example, that, and we have mentioned already, that we have Article 33 of the Constitution that speaks about the rights of women.
Yeah.
We have the Maputo Protocol that I mentioned earlier on, civil and political rights, the International Convention. But also we know that courts have gone ahead to make judicial law. She mentioned the FIDA case that dealt with, I think, the Divorce Act. But also there are many other issues that the court has dealt with, the issue of female genital mutilation, among others. So I don't know, the legal regime, is it sufficient?
Okay. Let me tell you one thing. In terms of the legal framework, Uganda doesn't have any insufficiency of law.
Implementation.
Uganda doesn't have any insufficiency of law. Because, let me tell you, even tomorrow, if there is going to be a very progressive legislation, Uganda will be the first to append their signature tomorrow. But as to when they will apply, as to when it will be applied, now that is another question. So in terms of internationally, we have a lot of frameworks.
Okay.
We have of course, you mentioned about the International Convention on Civil Political Rights, which provides right to participation, actually, it is the anchor of democracy, participation, and pluralism. And the underlying philosophy around that is equal representation, equality of representation, participation, no one should be left behind, rights, voice, the entire idea of organization and belonging, political belonging. Women actually even have rights to belong to political parties and groups. So in terms of, and we've also seen in terms of the national governance architecture and structure providing at least a structure upon which women can participate. We have the Women Council, which is a statutory body established by the law. We also have the women representation in parliament, that indirectly elected position. Initially, it actually used to be an electoral college. Going back to what Joseph was saying, it used to be an electoral college until in 2001. That the last electoral college was 2001 when they reversed it, also through a law. But even when the reversal was done, we've seen at least women access political spaces, and it is not a mistake that today we have a prime minister who is a woman. That is supposed to tell you, and that even still gets back into the national psyche, because Uganda now know that yes, women are capable of leading. You see, because the more we see them in these spaces, the more it gets ingrained in our national psyche. So we have enabling frameworks. We have the Constitution, which you rightly said, Article 33, which provides affirmative action for women. And the general philosophy of the Constitution also says anybody who has been a victim of historical injustice must be a beneficiary of affirmative action. Yeah, even through courts, we've really seen jurisprudence that is quite progressive. In 2018, when I was still a student at LDC, for me, when it comes to sexual offenses, there is a case I always do. Is it in Tambi? There is a case which actually, which I found it was really very progressive, that you no longer now need to corroborate sexual offenses. Now, corroborate what? So, meaning in the mind of the Supreme Court, even the whole idea of corroboration is already creating red tape of justice to a woman who has been violated. You see? So, in terms of domestically, we have a number of laws, even policies. We have a lot of gender strategies, gender policies under Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development. But like I told you, the whole challenge is on the implementation aspect. But also, even when we are to assess implementation, we know it is a general problem of the Ugandan state in terms of, it is not only gender-related laws. If I'm not mistaken, Article 123 of our Constitution, and you know our Constitution also keeps changing and it's fluid. Our Article 123 of our Constitution also talks about international law and our domestic laws. So Uganda has, by the creation of Article 123, Uganda recognizes international conventions. Now, international conventions that we have the Maputo Protocol you've talked about, the Beijing Declaration on the rights of women, and generally, I think for the issue of women, of course, to be fair, we all need to agree that we need to put so much concerted effort so that we get to the ideal state where they need to be. And as we have seen with laws, like I mentioned on the chat show, I think about 4 weeks ago here, I said laws are just like a boat. They do not move by themselves. There is need for water for them to move. So that water is the spirit of the rule of law. So we actually need a spirit, because like the other time I was at Council, Rwakafuzu's place, and he said, rule of law is like the air we breathe. Without rule of law, we are going to all suffocate and die. So what is actually suffocating women is that this air, rule of law, within the state does not exist. So once the state is reorganized, the state becomes functional, the state supports liberal implementation of these liberal policies, then we shall reach a time where we shall finally maybe be taking whiskey with Eunice when we all agree that I think we have arrived. As of now, I think they don't agree with my arrivalism when it comes to gender equality.
Fair enough. Very, very amazing points there. Eunice, the aspect of culture and religion vis-a-vis the rights of women. I know that our customary marriage act here in Uganda does recognize polygamous marriages. And to me, I think those are some of the cultural practices that have laid or are a breeding ground for things like domestic violence, but also things that undermine the rights of women. But let's evaluate culture and religion just from a broad sense. How have they played a role in terms of women emancipation? Have they curtailed, or have they in fact been an aiding factor to, progress?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I would say that we know that all these are really issues of perspective. And maybe let me take this opportunity to honor one of those women who has worked tirelessly in terms of shifting the narrative around customary land law. That's the late Judy Adoko. She really helped many of us young advocates to understand that the issue of land rights was really deeply a cultural issue that we needed to deal with. And through her work, which inspired many of us, we came to understand that, yes, culture has excluded women in many ways, but you can also work with this culture to enable women. And I like the word that Joseph uses, enablement, as opposed to using the word empowerment, to enable women to be able to enjoy these rights. So while customary law had provisions that would protect women, the interpretation of it many times is what failed women from enjoying those rights. But I also know that culture in many ways has been a barrier to women's enjoyment of their rights. I will speak on inheritance rights. I mean, culture clearly provided for the fact that it's the male child who inherits and excluded the female gender. So that in itself, you can see that. And then you see a lot of the subordination that women experience, especially in religious spaces, is also interpretation of religious text. And this is both, whether Christian or otherwise, it's just really how these religious texts are interpreted. If you're to think about the one religious text that most people quote on women submit to your husbands, it's then interpreted as women subordinate to your husbands. And no one ever really tries to interpret the fact that the same portion of scripture speaks about men love your wives just as Christ loved the church. So this other part is excluded.
Strategically.
Strategically. But this part where women are supposed to submit to their husbands, which
is amplified.
is so amplified, and it has been used in many a times as a basis for violation. You're not submissive, etc., so you deserve it. A study was done many years ago which showed that even women believe that if a woman misbehaves, she should be beaten. Yeah, and so culture and religion is one of those domains that we really need to work on in terms of women's emancipation and liberation.
Wow, amazing. Well, we cannot say it all about the women. There is so much to talk about. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have regarding women. Let's shift gears a bit to the issue of the human rights scenario here in Uganda. Just not so long ago, about 2 weeks ago, we saw Eric Mwesigwa, who came out to say that he was tortured in the hands of state operatives. Then just last week, the same gentleman came around to overturn his same statement to say that he was tortured by the NUP party leadership, and he was promised some money. So I don't know, very controversial statements right there.
50 million.
So Joseph, I don't know, how does this augur in your mind as a citizen? Who is fooling who?
I don't know. I think that this is happening in 2022, 2023
Yeah. That's the good
is a
question.
manifestation of how far back as a nation we've gone. And I actually don't know whether this is a clear indictment of the state of the nation, a clear indictment on the NRA regime, or an apparent indictment on the new kid on the block called Noop. Honestly, I, in part, have been extremely busy the last 3 weeks, to the extent that I've got 1 or 2 friends' messages that came in and I couldn't respond because I couldn't really engage much. Eunice, I have been in and out of the country, inclusive. So I haven't followed very deeply like I normally would in terms of the real news behind the headlines.
Yeah.
About basically who is really doing what rather than who's fooling who. But whatever the case is, the burden of responsibility lies with the state.
Yeah.
Now, is it the case that the question of torture, a torture victim, ends with my good friend Felix Kuleiji at Mboya? Or is it something that
dressing like Maliamungo.
He
He was dressed like Maliamungo.
that did not go unnoticed. And by the way, it hit the social media headlines like zero, including an attempted comparison of the beauties and presentations of Maliamungo and my good friend Felix. But that is one. But also, as I was saying, isn't it a matter that this guy should have been paraded, if at all, by, again, my very good brother, I think I'm quite privileged, a good brother, Martins Okoth-Ochola, the Inspector General of Police, but flanked by lawyers and you young, eminent lawyer presenter. By the way, you do your job quite well. Sometimes people forget that you're a lawyer rather than a journalist, so good stuff. So flanked by yourselves, food for thought. No, this is a state in anarchy, the Republic of Uganda. If this regime can claim genuine security and that somebody can be tortured without a direct and a clear and apt response by the security services, that's the role of the state. Protection of the lives and property of the citizens, and for the police, making sure provisions for ensuring law and order. So regardless of the background, if in the unlikely event that this was staged by the other side, then I'm afraid the people who fool themselves more are the state. Because they don't get out of it either way. However,
they are damned if they do,
yes,
damned if they don't.
Absolute responsibility. However, I actually find it very strange that an individual would seek, and by the way, Eunice, I fear violence. That's why Musiime is very lucky, because I'm thoroughly opposed to violence. Because I've said it and I'll say it again, that in the event that I was a citizen who liked violence, like people like football and they kill themselves for British football, I would have been a very eminent opponent of this regime. And maybe the map of the Ugandan political history would be very different. But I don't even watch violent movies. So just looking at this funnies, looking at this, I can't watch. I can't watch. So it was very difficult to see.
So you cannot watch a horror movie?
No, I can't, and I don't. And although,
but you're watching Uganda.
Uganda is already a horror movie.
Unfortunately, I'm the center of it. Yes, my niece calls them camera tricks. Called movies camera tricks. So although you quite know they're clearly camera tricks, I don't. But anyway, so how does somebody voluntarily and freely subject themselves to that? It tells you actually that if true, the level of despair for economic survival in this country by a young citizenry, most of whom are men, but some of whom might actually blame feminism for their plight.
No capitalism here.
Well, no, feminism, I'll put it that very simplistic, but it's actually neoliberal capitalism, which is part of the problem, is another telling thing. So I brought another context to this.
But capitalism is not a problem.
If we reach the stage, of course, DP is a capitalist organization.
That's
with
their ideology.
That's the ideology. But that's a slide of conversation. Let me just say that. To reach a stage in which it tells you the underlying realities in this country, that people are so desperate that they're prepared to do anything to earn a living. Maybe, again, Comrade Museveni, that is some food for thought for you and the people who follow you like zombies. So really, it is hard. But then, Noop, where is this young political opposition organization called Noop? If true, why would they seek to go to these extremes? There is a Ugandan friend of Mr. Museveni.
Maybe perhaps Okidi answered that. You must problematize. I'm sure there's a problem.
And then I'll tell you.
Maybe they're justifying donor funds.
Well, but whatever the case.
Yeah.
But, and actually that's because I'm answering that.
Yeah.
Museveni's friend, Yogadola, that's official. Museveni, the only surviving members for NASA Central Executive Committee.
But Yogadola is a UPC ideologue.
I'm defining yoga in context. You know,
They are from nonsense.
I want to bring in Chris.
was
So,
is Yogadola. So the only two people alive in the founding of Fronaza is Museveni and Yogadola. So you better respect Museveni, you know. So anyway, so Yogadola said, you know, when there was a video, some stuff doing the rounds, that Obote got space for Museveni in Dar es Salaam, you know, at the university. Yoga, first of all, it's not true. Because in it, some people were so desperately trying to talk down Museveni that he couldn't qualify to go to university. When actually, the poor guy actually...
He's a smart guy.
Well, the guy got his grades thanks to UPC education in the 60s and went to Dar es Salaam University. So that's credit to Mr. Museveni. But the point Yogadola was making is, Museveni, there is so many mistakes
But
and
did
errors.
He finish? Maybe tell us.
No,
Did he finish?
no, I think he did. Well,
He did. By the way,
did.
I'm an alumni of Dar es Salaam University.
If-
oh, no wonder you also have a soft spot for these guys in I'm joking. No. There is so much that you can pick from Mr. Museveni and NRA and this regime in 37 years. Add 4 years of atrocities in Luwero. There is so much you can hang these guys on. But you don't need to create anything. So that is if true that this thing was designed for some accountability things. I see these things every day. So if there are any funders out there who want to really genuinely support the people of Uganda, come to Ochieno, Uganda People's Congress program. We'll sort you guys out. Of course, there are some other individuals in Uganda People's Congress who are dancing with the NRA. So really, but that's sad. But the implications is huge. That's extended anarchy. In conclusion, I know we have no time. I feel really, really genuinely very, very sad that such a thing has happened. And I can't wait to hear from my two colleagues. I can't wait to know the truth. And by the Eunice, this is one of those few cases for which we need to go to the tilt to know exactly what the truth is. And I'm interested in hearing, maybe I'll come back to you, hearing to know exactly what happened. Because if the state the state is playing, the state needs to be held to account. But if these guys in the other political organizations are playing, they need to be held to account, and maybe somebody needs to answer to the citizens of this country beyond whatever is being played on television.
Okay, Chris, let me hear from you.
Yeah, for me, I think it is just state failure. No wonder recently the American embassy, was it October or November last year? The American embassy actually said that Uganda is a fragile state, classified Uganda as a fragile state. Now, what is a fragile state? A fragile state is a situation where there is factionalism within the state. You see? Now, what this is supposed to tell you is that Uganda, because in any state, there should be only one person who should monopolize violence. You see that? And that monopoly of violence should be the state.
Oh, that's great.
You see that? And so if the state is not the one that exercises its monopoly of violence, and then someone else did what they did to Mwesiga, then I think the state of Uganda has first of all failed Mwesigwa. Because the state is a duty bearer in terms of protecting Mwesigwa's right. And more especially...
Chris, do I have a right to injure myself? Do I have that right to harm myself?
No, you don't.
You don't have that right, yes. So, because the state...
You made a very good point.
Yeah, because the state...
It's
The
like
state
saying you have
here...
a right to death, like decide, let me kill myself.
Yes, you don't have a right to that.
No, but I think one of what Moses is saying, basically to counter the point the two of us are making.
but what I'm saying,
actually
Moses,
Mesiga made it, actually, the state should
but
not
you
be
see, Moses,
held responsible.
but you see Moses here. So if the state, if Mwesigwa was tortured, I think he was failed by the state.
Oh, no, that's true.
Because the state should protect him.
No, Moses is saying that
And
if the
also-
guy acted
voluntarily.
No, even if he acted voluntarily,
All right.
it is even still wrong because the state must protect him. You see, do you know that even in criminal liability, I'm sure that is something you're aware of. That even you're just a witness to the state, even if the affront is on you. You're just a state witness. That is why it is the office of the DPP to deploy all resources to ensure that justice is achieved for you. With you as a bystander just cooperating with the state so that affront is addressed. So And by the way, torture is a very bad thing.
Inhumane.
Let me tell you, by the way, in terms of all rights, in terms of all violations, the worst is torture. Why? Because the human body is inviolable. You see? Why we are all annoyed about all these things is that the human body is inviolable. Don't touch my body without my permission. Who are you? Even when I disagree with you, or even if there's a difference of opinion, or even if I have insulted you, you see, or even if I have also committed a crime, still touching my body, it is already unlawful. And this is even I'm going to
use that argument for women's rights.
Yes, I want to build
women's bodies are violated day in, day out.
But the human body is inviolable.
Yeah.
That is the principle where we have personal injury cases, and many of all these issues around torture and what, because no one should touch your body, never. You see? That is why you even decide who to shake. Has anybody ever been arrested for refusing to shake a hand with anybody? No, because it is your body and you decide. You see? Who to engage with or not. So, and there is a case, this case that when you're studying constitutional law, everyone studying constitutional law reads about it.
Ex parte Matovu.
Ex parte Matovu case. Now, you see, ex parte Matovu case even gives a very strong philosophy and idea on human rights and citizen relationship. The lawyer of Matovu was Abubakar Mayanja.
Mayanja, yes.
Now, Abubakar Mayanja, his pleadings, first of all, were even defective. You see? But do you know what the judge said? The judge said that, you see, this is about the life and right of a citizen. We cannot go into issues of form.
Yeah.
That pleadings are floppy, or procedures are flaunted, or what. This is the life of the citizen, and it is the duty of the state. Even when he actually said, even when the proceedings are floppy, it is the duty of the state to protect their citizens. And that is when he now set up that principle on habeas corpus.
It has never been appealed. It wasn't appealed.
Yes, habeas corpus. Now, and he said that when it comes to habeas corpus proceedings, man, it doesn't matter whether my pleadings are very funny or what. The question here
The liberty of a citizen
is the liberty of a citizen is at stake. Now, a citizen has been violated by his body, and you have no shame to just come instead of going to look for, even if it is Bobby Wine or NUP that tortured them. Let them go and investigate. Let them use all state machineries, all state resources, get to the depth and bring it. Because as a country, we also have the right to know.
To know.
Yes.
That's a good way to conclude. Eunice, I don't know. These scenes to me are very, very disturbing. And this coming in the 21st century, like Joseph said. But also, I've read a book by Michelle Arong, who is the story of a Kenyan whistleblower. And she talks about the reign of Daniel Arap Moi. And she tells you how violence and torture was used by both the state, but also the non-state actors. So, I don't know. What do you make of this?
Wow, that's a good point to make. I would say, though, I agree with Joseph and Chris on this one. For me, just watching that spectacle of the press conference, if I were Mr. Museveni, I would be very sad. I would be very sad that I'm presiding over a state, a nation, and a regime that is not smart. And in light of the fact that we have a lot of external forces that are working pretty hard to extinguish us. We are a small nation in the grand scheme of things. I mean, on the global stage, on the world market, in terms of all these different statistics, our GDP, whatever, we are nowhere. So when I think about the external forces that you'd want your country, the leaders of your country, to be smarter, at least in terms of strategy, against the external forces that we are up against. And then you see that press conference and you're like, who are these people who are in charge of this nation? Even if they wanted to dispute and dispel the credibility and legitimacy of NUP, what other ways can it be done rather than that spectacle that they imagined? So one of the things, I remember one of the persons, Andrew Karamaji, said, these guys actually think we are very dumb, that we can actually believe this, what they have just showed us.
So Eunice, you're already prejudicial. You already made a judgment that it is just gimmicks. It is just playing to the gallery, and that the NUP could not be guilty as the victim
we
is
don't
claiming
actually know. We don't know whether NUP is guilty, but we know that the person who holds power in this country is the state.
The state, that's right.
And therefore, the state has all weapons that it could have used to make sure that this story is made believable. So even before you call for a press conference, what were the collaborating facts? Was a case filed? Why didn't Eric go and helped with a state that was now calling the press conference, go and file a case against NUP? Because isn't that the normal procedure? Is the normal procedure calling a press conference? What was the rush? Where is the evidence? Considering like what Chris has said and Joseph has said, that this is a state that has all this infrastructure and apparatus at its hands. Why isn't it employing it and using it? So for me, it's like maybe I should also go the Chris way and say this judge who said you are right. And you're also right. But we are also saying that the state has all the...
So the state is also right. And NUP is
also right. But the state has the power to do all the investigations that it needed to do and present to us more credible facts. So none of us, we are private citizens. Am I going to investigate NUP? No. The state has all the apparatus. I pay all my taxes so that state can do its job. So for me, my take on this is let the state do the job that it's paid to do.
Joseph, part of the accusations that I've come across from certain people is that the NUP could have masterminded this for the sole purpose of trying to lobby public sympathy, but also trying to make the NRM government look as bad as possible. Perhaps because someone asked that at this point in time, why would the NRM torture a citizen? Is there a contestation? Is there any political competition right now? And they're saying that the NRM has no reason at this point in time. There is no motivation. All right? There is no mens rea for them to commit such offenses. So now the question is, I don't know, do you think that political parties in the opposition, where you belong, could at times be motivated to do things like this to gain political mileage and advantage?
You took mens rea. Has NRA had a timetable when the tortures, when does not torture? Do you know the funny thing? Many a time I've actually argued that I actually don't understand, for example, how NRA could go ahead and use and abuse citizens during by-elections, where he took that, Is it about a season? Is it about a time? Is it about a timing? No. NRA at any time when Mr. Museveni feels his power base and his interests are threatened, he will act, and he's done that since he tells you in his funny book, The Mastered Lies, that as way back as 1965, he was asking and checking with the Ubukama of Ankole, that we need to be able to sort out these guys, So no, that is Mr. Museveni, and that's a matter of fact. And because the truth is that is Mr. Museveni, and the truth is that is how the man has handled this country. From the time he came in 1987. Our DP friends will tell you, how he manipulated them from as way back as July, August 1985. Mr. Museveni will do it at any time. Let's not make it controversial. What happened to Kaira? The other day I was at a certain national university having conversations with some decent scholarly guys, and then you begin to look at details. Some of this, you wonder why some of these things should be done. No, did Mr. Museveni have to cause the death of 54 plus Ugandan citizens at the last elections? Was it really a massive do and die? I was talking to women's conference, Eunice, when I was at
Tell us about the Luwero scans. Are they for NRA or they are for UPC?
Of course, NRA was absolutely responsible for the Luwero scans. With evidence, check Milton Obote's notes on concealment of genocide in Uganda. Read it. Just as Wechers is responsible for the atrocities in your own northern Uganda. And again, ask Kizza Besigye, go and read about a brilliant genocide and watch the movie. So these things are there. But no, we don't want to hang Mr. Museveni, certainly from UPC's perspective. We're simply saying that Ugandans ought to know these things.
And he's a product of UPC.
We need to have a faith. No, he was 9 years in DP.
He's a product of UPC.
Yes.
He served as
In 1964.
as a presidential.
Let me have this guy.
In 1964, when Kakonge was fired, Right Omongin, the UPC youth leader, invited Yoweri Museveni, Akiki Mujaju, Chango Makyo wa Obanda for a meeting to protest against the overthrow of Kakonge.
So then actually tells you that how dubious Mr. Museveni is, because Mr. Museveni was not in 1964. I don't know how old he was, but on the other hand, and he was a terrible guy. So he should not prevent young Ugandans protesting in the streets of Kampala. No, in 1964-65, Moses, up to 1960, Eunice, up to 1970, when Mr. Museveni joined the president's office, he was DP, and he himself has said he was DP for 9 years and the UPC for 9 months. So he joined the UPC when he was in president's office, and he went to president's office as a Ugandan public servant who had graduated like anybody else. You can get a job as a president's office. So Museveni was in UPC for 9 months. But that's neither here nor there. The guy must take his own cross, and if you're trying to politicize Museveni's responsibilities, DP might take a lot more of it, actually, considering the historical record backing Museveni, one leg in bush, one leg in parliament, and equally what DP did in 60.
But they say...
But no, Chris, not about that. No, Chris, I know it's a conversation you and I can have. But on a serious note...
So back to my question.
Yes.
Is it possible for political opposition parties to be motivated to make a regime look bad and therefore begin to do orchestrate?
And that's what I said. There's absolutely no need.
Mr.
Museveni's on track record, including part of what Chris is trying to joke about. You can pick Mr. Museveni and unearth this guy. This guy can be unearthed on the basis of what he's actually done. You can actually unearth Museveni. Museveni's regime can fall on the basis of Museveni's track record of the last 2 years only. Look at the scandals of Karamoja. Look at the scandals over Entebbe International Airport. Look at the scandals over UNRWA. Look at the death of 54 Ugandans. During the last elections. How many Ugandans died during the 1980 general elections, which was contested between UPC and DP? No, there is enough to make this guy go to Lozira for the rest of his life until his grandchild. There is no need for political opposition to do that. This conversation, particularly following on to the women's conversation, let's contextualize our polity. Let's make our politics matters of issues. Let's pin Mr. Museveni on the question of human rights. Let's pin Mr. Museveni on the question of service delivery. And any political party that wants to learn, and I can give them free consultants, maybe subsidized. And I'm being very honest. I can help teach any political organization and their leaders how to do these things. After all, I benefit out of it because long term we want democracy in this country. Sure. There is no reason to tell lies about NRA or about anybody else.
Chris, is this statecraft at play?
You know me, I'm a student of propaganda.
Lie.
No, me, I'm a student. No, me, I'm a student of propaganda.
We need many students.
Yeah, because you see, you can only deconstruct propaganda when you have read propaganda. And there are various types of propaganda.
So who is propagating it in this case?
Yes, we need to first understand the various types of propaganda. You see, there is what we call civic rhetoric as a type of propaganda, which is very constructive and useful propaganda. You see, it is a tool of the weak. When you like the blacks in America, when they discovered that they were weak, the Du Bois Du Bois. Is
Bois,
that
yes.
how they,
Du Bois,
who
yeah.
came up with the black, the very pioneers
Fantastic
of
guys,
civil
yes,
rights.
yes.
Yeah. So he said that, you see, no one should accuse blacks who are already victims of oppression from doing anything that can make them get out of their oppression. You see that?
And Mandela,
And he said-
Mandela contextualizes that
Yes,
in the
yes.
early part of the 60s on the basis of the
Yes,
argument against
yes.
apartheid.
And
Yes.
that is why he says that that is why he coached a specialized propaganda called civic rhetoric. That is why even when you say anything about government, even when it is wrong, as long as it is for a legitimate cause and to cause a positive change, it is right. You see that?
Wow.
So even if NUP did that to Mwesigwa as a strategy to solve our problems of Museveni's dictatorship, I would really not blame NUP for delivering that. You see?
Even
But-
when it violates.
Regardless of the impact, but regardless of the impact.
But this is the disclaimer I want to make.
Yeah.
The disclaimer I want to make is that I have been in Uganda's opposition for a long time. I know you've been longer than me, but for you, you've been in an external wing. Me,
No,
I have been in the trenches here. And besides, I led even a very dynamic.
Stop pushing me away, my brother.
But I even led a very dynamic youth organization called the Uganda Young Democrats. So I
give it to you,
I know
anyway.
what we are capable of doing, and
Yeah.
you know, majority are in NUP.
All right.
But let me tell you one thing is, Uganda's opposition has never contemplated picking arms on Museveni,
Yeah.
using a strategy to, like, ironing a citizen like Mwesigwa. If it is something that is starting today, then it is just starting today.
And Mr. Museveni should be very
But
worried.
I have been guild president, from the time I have been guild president on DP ticket. I even led the DP Youth League and was in charge, even crafting these dodgy Watako people talk about. These are things Okidi crafted. Everyone knows that.
Yes, Okidi. Go ahead.
Everyone knows that, yes. But we have never contemplated anything that can cause death of the Ugandan public, or it can injure or cause death to any individual. Opposition are legitimately fighting to change this regime. They are only victims of state violence. The violence and the human rights violation comes from the state.
The state.
And me, by the way, and this is something we shouldn't even gloss over. The other time I even said here that I now know who owns the skulls of the Luwero Triangle. It is not us from northern Uganda who they say, you see, you guys are killers. You know, in 96, Museveni lined skulls, over 5 kilometers of skulls along Luwero, to demonize northern Uganda, that these are the people who violated your rights, killed you. But now, if then the same government that changed is ironing citizens, is killing people demonstrating on the streets, then I actually now know that I think these guys should be traced from the formation of RONASA. That is when they started perfecting.
That is
the
absolutely
human rights
true.
violation.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Eunice, you have the last question on the show, and which is, has political contestation forced us to throw our humane conscience through the window? That even if you really want the NRM out, do you have to go to this extreme? I don't know. Even if, I don't know.
You're
Humanity.
still back there, despite what they've said. But anyway, I since I have the last word, I would say the same thing and say we are in deep chaos. I think there have been many manifestations of the crisis that we are undergoing as a country. But for me, that's just one of them. That's one manifestation that for me brought me to that realization that we are, let me clean up my language, we are in deep chaos. And so going forward, it's not even about NRM, it's not about NUP, it's about us as Ugandan citizens thinking deeply about what next for this country and what do we need to do more in a formidable way to try and get us of this pit, get out of this pit that we are in. So it's no longer about contestations between NRM, NUP, etc. I think it's time that as citizens of Uganda, and I'm glad that this Civic TV talk show is a citizens show. It's really about us as citizens of Uganda, looking at what we are seeing as that tipping point. For me, this is one of those that we need to really deeply ask ourselves, how can we come back?
Wow, gentlemen and lady, our time is fast spent. Can I give you 30 seconds just to say your last words on the show?
Yeah,
Chris, just 30 seconds.
my last word is going to stem from the first segment, which is around women's rights. Yeah, I don't want, just because I want to emphasize so that I'm not misunderstood. Yeah, I know we still need a lot of work around areas of gender equality. But now I think moving forward, we are in an age of the collective. Everyone is required. That is why these binary perspectives and dichotomies of differences should actually be merged into cooperation. And the world is also going into a new age of more cooperation, peace and cooperation, what actually many people call the age of the Aquarius. Yeah.
Just like
wow.
Joseph Nye in his book.
Yeah.
Yes, Joseph.
I think going forward, national conversations must continue. Responsible organizations in this country, including civil society organizations, and as I said, Charlie, political organizations must take charge on these conversations of the question of gender, mainstream the conversation so that we look at the qualitative need of women in this country and see it actually as a national security question in this country, as indeed it is, if you like, a national security question on the African continent going forward. And that only that shall we realize that we're not doing anybody a favor, we're not doing women a favor, but actually we are charting a clear path for our own destinies, for ourselves and posterity. On the question of human rights, it's a shame, it's a ring indictment of NRA, and indeed, as Chris says, maybe it's time the younger people in this country began to ask what took Museveni to the bush and what promises made in 1986 and how many promises has been making every election cycle, which elections are not basically settling him rather than having an election anyway. And so that it's a shame really that considering the experience we've had in the name of democracy, in the name of seeking alternative arrangements, that we should still be going through what we've just seen. And as I said, regardless of the underlying reasons, it's a shame, but at some stage, somebody must take responsibility, and actually the state has got to explain this to the citizens of this country.
Eunice, you have the last words. Finally.
My last words. Since we're reflecting on Women's Day, a topic and subject that is very, that I'm very passionate about. I was just thinking about President Suluhu yesterday, spent time with the main opposition party in Tanzania.
Yeah.
So I look forward to a time when we can sit here and have conversation, including with members from the ruling party, without the animosity and the polarization and the deep oppression that we currently see. So as an eternal optimist, I hope that day will come one day, hopefully, when I'm still alive.
Wow. Thank you very much, Council Okidi. Thank you very much, Congressman and Director Eunice. Thank you very much for making the time to be on this week's episode of the Citizens Chat Show. Well, it's a happy Women's Month. To the men out there, show the women love. Take them out. I mean, just show them some love. Make them feel appreciated. Make them feel valued. Make them feel acknowledged about
Remember, it is
their
not
contribution.
Valentine's Day. It is Women's Day.
It's Women's Day. Show your mother, show your girlfriend, your sister, any woman, just show them some love this particular month. Well, from us to you, we say have a lovely evening. See you next week, same time, same place.